Have you ever heard a child's voice when there shouldn't be one, echoing out across a dead frequency in a place long forgotten? What would you do if the first thing you heard wasn't a scream or a threat, but a whisper that simply said, "Please help my mom"? The starlight had long since faded behind the gas giant's curve, leaving only a rust-colored crescent to guide Captain Jack Carter's descent toward Revo 7. The outpost looked like a fossilized carcass embedded in rock, its landing bay rusted open like a broken jaw. No welcoming lights, no transmission codes, just the static hum of a station abandoned decades ago by everyone who had the good sense to leave. Jack wasn't there for company. He was there for salvage. Old navigation cores, pre-fall processors, maybe even a backup comms drive if the scavengers hadn't stripped it already. He'd been doing this run for years. Quiet places, dead stations, no questions asked. That's what made what happened next so strange. He had just set the Starbird down, dust pluming around its side jets, when the emergency channel on his console crackled to life. No prompt, no trigger, just sudden sound. Is someone there? The voice was small, not broken, not robotic, a child. Jack froze, one hand hovering over the panel. "Please," it was a girl. "I know this place is supposed to be empty, but I can hear your ship. My mom is hurt, she can't move. Please help us." He stared at the console like it had just spoken in tongues. Then the voice came again, this time lower, quieter. "Please don't leave." He was already on his feet, grabbing his field pack before the sentence ended. Outside, the station's hull groaned under its own decay. Hallways flickered with backup lights running on reserves they shouldn't still have. Dust hung in the air like the memories of people who'd run out of time. Jack moved fast. He followed the signal deeper into the maintenance wing, his footsteps echoing off metal grates and fractured walls. The voice guided him now, soft and uncertain, but steady. "Down here past the red door. Take a left, I'll keep talking so you can find us." She didn't sound afraid. Not exactly. She sounded like someone who had already lived through the worst part. When he reached the final corridor, he saw her. A small figure crouched beside a larger body. The child was thin, violet-skinned, with wide silver eyes that looked too old for her size. She wore a patched flight suit 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up, boots too wide. Her hair was braided unevenly, the way a kid does it when no one helps. The woman beside her was clearly her mother, pale, barely breathing, with one arm wrapped around her torso and blood soaking through the fabric. Jack knelt down slowly. "I'm Jack. I'm here to help." The girl didn't move. She looked at him like she was trying to decide if he was real or just one more hallucination brought on by hunger and grief. "My name's Nori," she said finally. "This is my mom, Alira." Jack checked her vitals. Weak but stable if treated soon. He opened his medkit. "Do you know what happened?" "She saved me. That's all I know." There was no fear in her voice, only trust, not in him, in her mother. As Jack worked, Nori stayed close, watching every motion, like she was memorizing the act of care for the first time. Once the bleeding slowed and the stabilizer kicked in, Jack looked up. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Nori nodded. There was no food left. No water, no power. But I couldn't leave her alone. Jack swallowed. "You did good, kid." She looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Then she said something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. "If I ask something, can you say yes?" "Depends what it is." She took a deep breath. "Can you marry my mom so she doesn't have to be alone anymore?" Have you ever heard a question so honest it knocks the wind out of you? Not because it's loud or clever, but because it's the kind of truth no adult would ever dare ask out loud. What would you say if a child asked you to be her father? Not out of fantasy, but as a lifeline. Jack Carter didn't answer right away. How could he? He sat on the floor of a broken corridor next to a wounded alien woman and her daughter, the flickering lights casting long shadows over rusted steel. Nori's eyes stayed locked on him, not demanding, not pleading, just hopeful. A child's version of hope, the kind that hadn't yet learned what to fear. He cleared his throat and spoke gently. "Let's take care of your mom first, then we'll talk about everything else." "Okay." Nori nodded slowly, as if that were the most reasonable thing in the world. Jack carried Alira back to his ship, moving carefully, her weight light but limp. Nori walked beside him the entire way, one small hand clinging to the edge of his jacket. Back aboard the Starbird, Jack laid Alira in the medbay and ran a full diagnostic. Her injuries were bad, but not fatal. Multiple fractures, internal bruising, dehydration, infection creeping in through untreated wounds. But she was a fighter. He administered antibiotics, cleaned the wounds, and let the auto mender do its quiet work. Nori stood at the door the entire time, not fidgeting, not speaking, just watching. After a while, Jack handed her a warm drink and gestured to the co-pilot's chair. "Sit here, you're part of the crew now." Her eyes widened. "Really? For now?" "Just until your mom wakes up," she took the seat with reverence, like she'd just been invited onto a royal throne. The ship lifted off gently from Revo 7, dust trailing in its wake, the station shrinking behind them like a memory already fading. Jack set course for a remote medical station in the Orion fringe. Quiet, neutral, no questions asked. The kind of place where you could disappear for a while and patch up what was broken, inside and out. Over the next few days, Nori became a shadow, trailing him through the ship. She didn't ask for toys or treats or attention. She asked where the wrenches were stored. She asked what the blinking lights meant on the nav console. She asked how gravity stabilizers worked. Jack answered every question. Sometimes with a diagram, sometimes with a grunt. She soaked it all in like someone desperate to matter. On the fourth day, Alira woke up. She didn't speak right away, just opened her eyes and scanned the medbay until they landed on Nori, asleep in a blanket nest at the foot of the bed. Then she saw Jack. "You stayed." "Yeah," he said. "Just until you're better." Alira tried to sit up and winced. Nori stirred and bolted upright. "Mom, hey love." They wrapped around each other in silence. No tears, just breathing. After a while, Nori looked at Jack and whispered, "Did you think about it?" "About what?" "The question." He glanced at Alira. She raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. "What question?" Nori turned to her mother, innocent and proud. "I asked him if he'd marry you so we can be a real family." Alira blinked once, then twice. Then let out a sound that might have been a laugh if she weren't still healing. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. It was a strong opening line. She shook her head slowly. "That's not how this works, baby." "Why not?" "Because grown-ups take time." "Do you want him to?" Alira paused, looked at Jack. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, like someone who wasn't trying to impress her but wasn't going anywhere either. "I don't know yet," she said softly, "but I'm not saying no." Nori grinned wide. "That's a maybe." Jack chuckled. "It's definitely not a no." They spent that evening eating soup made from protein packs and laughing at Nori's attempts to rename all the ship's systems. By the end of the night, Jack added 2 more names to the crew manifest. Passenger 1, Alira passenger. 2, Nori status. Pending. What happens when something familiar sounds just a little off? When the silence you've grown used to hums with a note that wasn't there yesterday. Do you ignore it, or do you listen closer, even when part of you doesn't want to know? The Starbird had been drifting peacefully through the Lyrae Passage for nearly 2 days. Jack liked this stretch of space. No patrols, no trade lanes, no recorded pirate activity in over a decade. Just dark stars, distant suns, and the occasional asteroid humming its lonely tune. Alira had recovered enough to walk short distances, though she still winced when moving too fast. Nori was happier now that her mother was awake, but Jack noticed something else behind her eyes. A kind of alertness. The way she scanned the room before speaking. The way she tilted her head like she was listening for a sound no one else could hear. Jack didn't press. Kids carried things they couldn't name. He just kept the ship running and let them be, until the echo came. It started as a flicker in the signal diagnostics. Not a distress call, not a standard ping, a soft repeat of an old navigational signal, but layered beneath it something stranger. Alira walked into the cockpit just as Jack leaned in close to the console. You hear that, she frowned. What is it? Signal overlay. Hidden channel. Buried deep in the nav band, can you trace it? Working on it. Nori appeared behind them, silent as always. She pointed at the console. That's the sound I've been hearing. Jack's hands froze. You didn't think to mention that. She shrugged small shoulders. I didn't want to scare Mom. Jack patched the signal through a decryption loop. The result was worse than static. It was a voice. Faint, distorted, and looping. Target identified, confirm extraction protocol. Alira went pale. Her hand gripped the edge of the console. We have to move. Now, Jack turned. What do you know? They found us. Who the ones who want her? Alira pointed at Nori, who was now holding Jack's jacket like a shield. She carries something in her DNA, something ancient. Something valuable. I thought it was destroyed in the fall of Cyrex Prime, but she still has it. What is it? Alira shook her head. I don't fully know, but they call it the core strain. It was part of the reason my people were hunted. We thought we hid the last child. Jack's blood ran cold. How did they track her? Alira's voice dropped to a whisper. She activated the old transmitter to call for help. It was enough. They only needed a fragment. The ship's sensors lit up. 3 vessels inbound from the starboard vector. Fast, armed. Not broadcasting any faction tags. Jack jumped into action. Strap in. We're not letting them take her. He fired the engine boosters and punched a spiral vector into the asteroid field nearby. It was suicide on a good day, but better than letting them board. Alira and Nori buckled into the co-pilot seats, eyes wide hands, clutching the arms of their chairs. The ship rocked as they entered the debris zone. Jack guided it through the narrowest paths, using only instinct and half-broken thrusters. One of the pursuing ships clipped a rock and exploded. 2 left. Jack rerouted power from shields to rear engines and dove toward the gravity well of a nearby moon. He'd seen this trick work once. It might work again. The moon's surface pulled at them hard, and the remaining enemy ships pulled up at the last second. The Starbird skimmed the edge-lost power for 3 terrifying seconds, then surged forward into the upper atmosphere and out the other side. Silence returned. Only the hum of the emergency stabilizers and the sound of Nori breathing hard beside him. Alira spoke first. That wasn't luck. Jack didn't answer. He simply turned the ship toward the fringe of known space and whispered, "No more signals, no more traces, no more running, unless we choose to." What would you do if the safest direction pointed straight into the dark? If every map warned you away, and every instinct said turn back, but the voice of a child beside you simply said, "Please don't leave me." What then? The Starbird drifted along the edge of the unmarked zone, the place cartographers simply labeled Void Sector 97. No patrols, no records, no rescue. Jack Carter had never flown this deep before, and he was starting to understand why. The stars here were dimmer, like they were hiding something. The further they went, the quieter the instruments became. The sensors couldn't get a read. The nav AI looped its calculations 3 times before simply giving up. Alira sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes narrow. "This is where they built the harvesting sites," she said. "They took our children here back when we still thought we had time to fight." Nori clutched Jack's jacket tighter. "I don't want to go back." "You're not," Jack said. "You're not going anywhere. I'm not with you." But Alira wasn't looking at Nori anymore. Her gaze was locked on a faint outline ahead. There. In the distance, beneath the skeletal remains of a shattered moon, floated a structure, not large, not lit, but present. A thing out of myth. Jack brought the ship in slow. The exterior was made of old alloy materials laced with dark veins of something not quite metal. Ancient designs spiraled along its surface like veins of forgotten circuitry. "There's no entry point," he muttered. "There is," said Nori quietly. "They always use the bottom deck." She knew this place too well. Jack found a breach just wide enough to maneuver through. The ship groaned in protest, but they slipped inside and landed on a circular platform surrounded by absolute black. The doors opened with a hiss. He led the way, Alira behind him, Nori between them. Inside the facility, the air was stale but breathable. The lights flickered to life, slowly revealing a corridor lined with what looked like stasis pods, all empty. "This was a nursery," Alira whispered. "Not the kind you think. They moved deeper." The walls began to hum as they passed, recognizing something or someone. Jack's hand hovered near his sidearm, but he didn't draw. Then came the voice, "You brought her back." It came from everywhere and nowhere. Jack spun around. "Who's there?" A shape emerged from the far end of the corridor. Tall humanoid wrapped in a cloak made from tech-woven strands, face obscured by a smooth silver mask. "You've no idea what she is, do you?" the figure said. "She's a child," Jack growled. "That's all that matters." The figure tilted its head. "She's the only one left with the sequence. The last viable strain. If we lose her, we lose the code." Alira stepped forward. "You already lost." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and the floor beneath them pulsed. Nori cried out as a hidden panel beneath her opened, and a net of blue light wrapped around her, lifting her into the air. "No!" Jack lunged forward, firing twice, but the shots dissipated against a kinetic shield. Alira slammed her fist into a wall panel, sending a surge through the circuit, and the light net flickered just enough for Jack to leap through it, arms outstretched. He caught Nori as they both fell hard to the ground, rolling across the metal floor. The figure raised its hand again, but Alira was already moving. She pulled a hidden blade from her boot and drove it into a console next to the wall. The system sparked, exploded, and every light in the hallway went out. In the darkness, Jack grabbed. Nori pulled her to her feet and ran. Footsteps echoed behind them. They didn't stop. They didn't look back. Only when they reached the starboard again and sealed the hatch did. "Anyone breathe?" Jack looked down at Nori. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, barely holding back tears. He turned to Alira. "What the hell was that?" "That was a warning," she said quietly. "They won't stop, then we won't run. How far would you go to protect a child when you've already crossed every line of logic, every map, every warning? Do you keep running, or do you finally turn and say, 'Enough, this far, no further'?" The Starbird limped through a dark corridor of uncharted space, its engines aching from the last escape. The hull was scorched in patches, the shields unreliable. Jack Carter didn't care. He was too busy plotting routes the old-fashioned way, tracing with his finger across a cracked nav pad while Alira sat beside him, rewrapping the bandage around her ribs. Nori slept, curled in the hammock above the cockpit. A blanket pulled up to her chin, her small hand still clutching a wrench. Jack stared at the screen, not really seeing it. "They won't stop," he said finally. "They'll keep tracking us until they get what they want." "They want her," Alira said quietly. "Not us. That doesn't make it better." She looked at him, brow furrowed. "So, what do you want to do?" "I want to disappear." She blinked. "That's not the answer I expected." "I don't mean give up. I mean actually disappear." "There's a place I've heard about on the Alara Rim. No ports, no patrols, just forest and sky and time." Alira leaned back in her chair. "You think it's real?" "I know it is. I flew med-evac there once during the war. We dropped supplies. No one asked questions and they let you land. Only if you ask nicely." They sat in silence for a while, the stars outside streaking slow and cold. Then Alira said, "You're not doing this just for her, are you?" Jack looked up. "What makes you think that?" "Because when she asked you to be her father, you didn't laugh." I was in shock. "No, you weren't. You looked like someone who'd been waiting to hear it." Jack smiled for the first time in hours. "Maybe I was." Alira didn't press. Instead, she stood, walked to the back of the cockpit, and gently lifted Nori from the hammock. "She needs rest, and we need fuel." Jack turned back to the console. "There's a trade station in 6 hours. No names, no scans. We'll risk it." 6 hours later, the Starbird touched down on a platform lit by old sodium lamps buzzing like lazy insects. Jack disembarked alone, scanning the crowds, mostly miners, smugglers, and drifters. No uniforms, no eyes. He made his way to a refueling terminal, paid in old credits, and traded 2 crates of spare parts for a heat core and medical gel. On his way back, he paused. A holoscreen in the corner flickered with static. Then it showed a face. His face wanted. Not for crimes, but for theft. Kidnapping, assault. The usual list. The bounty wasn't high, but it was real. He kept walking faster now. Back aboard the Starbird, he didn't say anything. Just hit the thrusters and left the station in the dust. Alira noticed someone saw you. He nodded. "She'll need a new name." "You too." They didn't speak of it again. By the time they reached the Alara approach, the ship was running lean, but the signal beacon was still there, a soft pulse on the old band. No questions asked, permission granted. As they descended through clouds thick with green mist, the first signs of life appeared. Forests stretching forever. Waterfalls shining in the morning light. Birds they couldn't name, and no ships in sight. Just peace. Jack landed beside a river and shut the engines down. For the first time in years, the silence felt right. They stepped outside together, boots sinking into moss. Alira took Nori's hand. Jack followed. No more schedules, no more signals. Only sky. When was the last time you heard nothing at all? No humming wires, no alert tones, no countdowns, just the honest hush of a world breathing on its own. Could you trust that silence again after a life full of alarms? Jack Carter stood at the edge of a shallow creek, watching the morning mist rise off the water. Alara was alive in a way that didn't demand attention. It simply was ferns, taller than a man, swayed with the rhythm of a breeze that felt unprogrammed, untouched. The air tasted clean damp with moss and root, and sunlight filtered through a canopy of trees as old as silence itself. Behind him, Alira and Nori worked together, laying stones around the base of a new shelter Jack had built from the ship's landing panels. It wasn't much, just a frame with reinforced polymer walls and a roof made from heat shielding, but it stood firm and dry, and for the first time in weeks it felt like something that could be called home. Nori laughed as a lizard with translucent wings landed on her shoulder. She named it Captain Wiggles, and demanded it be added to the crew roster. Alira indulged her with a mock salute. Jack smiled quietly from where he stood, pretending not to hear. They spent days like that, chopping and stacking wood, carving out footpaths between the river and the tree line, mapping the stars at night just in case. The solar panels charged enough juice for light and heat, and a short-range signal that Jack never turned on. He didn't need the galaxy anymore. One afternoon, as the light bent gold through the trees, Nori sat beside him on a flat stone, skipping pebbles across the water. "Are we staying forever?" she asked. Jack looked at her. "As long as you want," she kicked her legs. "Mom likes it here, do you?" "Yeah, it's like the stories she used to tell before everything broke." Jack nodded. She was quiet for a while, then said, "Do you like her?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Your mom." Nori nodded. "Yeah, a lot?" "Would you marry her if she asked?" He chuckled softly. "Probably." "What if I ask again?" Jack looked down at her. "You really want us to be a family?" "Huh?" "We already are," she said, matter of fact. Later that night, while Nori slept, curled against the shelter wall, Jack and Alira sat under the stars, sharing a bottle of water and passing the silence back and forth like an old tune. "She's growing attached," Alira said. "So am I," Jack replied. They didn't look at each other when they said it, but they didn't need to. The fire crackled low. A moth with wings like paper drifted between them and vanished into the dark. Alira spoke again. "Do you think they'll ever come for her again?" "I think they might." "And what then?" "Then we don't run," Alira nodded. "I never thought peace would feel so heavy." Jack leaned back against the wall. "That's how you know it's real. Do you remember the moment a title turned into something sacred? A name not spoken out of politeness or habit, but out of need, out of love, out of recognition. What does it take to earn that kind of word? The days on Alara had grown into weeks and weeks, into a rhythm. The trees around their home learned their footfalls. The birds stopped scattering when Jack walked past. The wind carried the smell of their cooking before it brought in the evening mist. And when the sun dipped behind the cliffs each night, it bathed the river in a light that made everything look briefly unreal. Jack spent his mornings rebuilding the second shelter, converting it into a workbench and storage cabin. He had scavenged more panels from the ship and with Alira's help reinforced the water catchment system. Nori helped too in her own way. She painted names on every tool using sticks dipped in crushed berries. Captain Wiggles got his own sign carved into the front gate, but things weren't perfect. Not always. Some nights Nori woke up crying, though she never remembered why. Alira sometimes stared too long at the sky as if counting the chances they had left. Jack still checked the scanner once a week just in case. Then came the storm. The biggest they had seen yet. It rolled in without sound at first. The treetops began to sway before the wind even arrived. The sky darkened in seconds, and the rain came in waves that felt like sheets of ocean turned sideways. Jack and Alira moved fast, pulling down the tarps securing the shelter. Nori was already inside her eyes, wide, not afraid but alert. Jack threw her a blanket and told her to hold tight. He and Alira braced the doors against the wind until it passed. When it was over, the world was quiet again, softer, as if everything had held its breath. The next morning, Nori walked into the clearing where Jack was repairing a snapped solar hinge. She held something in her hand, a piece of wood, no bigger than her palm, carved into a shaky heart. She handed it to him without speaking. He turned it over. On one side was a scribble that might have been a symbol. On the other was one word, Dad. He looked at her. "Really?" She nodded, then said, I waited to be sure. Jack crouched down, still holding the token in one calloused hand. "What changed?" "You stayed." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he wrapped his arms around her gently and whispered, "So did you." Alira watched from the doorway, not interrupting, not smiling, but something in her shoulders relaxed, as if a weight had finally eased. That evening they sat together under the open sky with a fire crackling between them. The smoke curled slowly upward, joining the stars in silence. They didn't talk about the word. They didn't need to. It had already been spoken. Some stories do not end in war. Some do not climax with betrayal or a final battle. Some simply settle into place like a stone in a stream shaped by time, held by current. And maybe those are the ones worth telling. The morning of the joining was quiet. Not ceremonial, not rehearsed. There were no guests, no music, no scripts. Just 3 people who had walked through fire and chosen to stay in the warmth that came after Jack wore the cleanest shirt he had. His boots still muddy from patching the roof. Alira braided her hair in the style of her mother, a long twist over her shoulder decorated with strands of silver wire. Nori picked flowers that grew along the riverbank, small blue things with soft petals, and tied them into a circle that she placed on Alira's head. "Do you want me to say something official?" Jack asked, standing beside the old tree where they had hung wind chimes from scrap metal. Alira smiled soft and real. "Only if it comes from you." He cleared his throat, rubbed his hands on his pants, and tried not to look nervous. "You didn't ask for this. You didn't plan for it. Neither did I. But somehow in this place, in this silence, I found something I didn't think was still out there. Something worth fighting for, worth staying for. You and her, and whatever this becomes tomorrow or the day after I choose it." Alira stepped closer and took his hands. "I don't know what the stars will bring, but I know I don't want to face them alone. Not anymore." They said no vows beyond that. Nori handed them 2 bands she had made from tree fiber and polished stone, and placed them in each other's hands like a priest and a child, all at once. They kissed, not for show, not for drama, but because it was the most honest thing to do. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and ash and something like cinnamon. The chimes rang just enough to remind them they were not dreaming. Later that night, as the fire burned low, and Nori slept curled between them, Jack looked at the stars and felt no need to leave. They had made something here, not perfect, not safe, but theirs. And in a universe built on taking, that was the rarest thing of all. If you've ever found family in someone unexpected, if you've ever been saved by staying instead of running, maybe this story speaks to you too. Tell us in the comments. If you've ever made a home where no one expected one could grow.